Okay, welcome. This is our River Valleys Day 5 review homework. We're going to start with a review of agriculture and then a review of Mesopotamia and then Egypt. We're also going to be looking at some of the similarities and differences between the two civilizations. So the first map we're looking at is a map of agriculture as it emerged in different river valleys. So far we've been over here. This is Mesopotamia, and over here in the Nile Valley. And as we know, the first agricultural beings, or people who figured out agriculture and figured out farming, were down here in East Africa. And then once they figured out how to farm, they settled in fertile, or places where you can grow food in fertile areas, over here in the Nile, here in the Tigris and Euphrates, and in other river valleys that we'll be talking about next week. So the Fertile Crescent is the first place where these nomadic people stopped. They stopped here in Egypt, and they stopped here in Mesopotamia. When you see a map that looks sort of like this and you're trying to figure out which civilization is which, remember the Mesopotamian civilization has two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, where Egypt only has one, the Nile River. Okay, so for Mesopotamia, Mesopotamia is known as the land between the two rivers because in between the Tigris and Euphrates is a very fertile area where when the rivers would flood, it would bring silt and good soil and make it a great place for farming. A negative about this region is that there are very few natural barriers. And what that means is that invaders could come into the area very easily and exploit or take resources or one way or another just invade the area. For example, people could come from the Mediterranean Sea and walk right over to Mesopotamia. They could come from the north. They could come from what's Persia over here, or from the Arabian Desert over here. Another negative about this region is that there's unpredictable flooding. People in Mesopotamia had no idea when it would flood or how big the flood would be. And like we discussed in class, sometimes the floods were good because they would bring silt and good soil, but they could also be devastating if the floods were too big. As far as Mesopotamia's culture, a lot of the culture was centered down here in Sumer. So this is in southern Mesopotamia. Notice here's the Tigris, Euphrates, and that right down at the bottom, right near the Persian Gulf, is where the kind of the center of culture was in Mesopotamia. All Sumerians or all Mesopotamians were polytheistic, just like all river valleys are, meaning that they believed in many gods and many goddesses. And the gods and goddesses pretty much controlled everything, whether it was the weather or the sun or the crops or people's emotions even, pretty much everything. And the Sumerians had many inventions. They figured out the wheel, which made trading much easier. They figured out a writing system called cuneiform. They figured out the plow, which made farming much easier, and a number system. And you will see on your quiz, you will have to identify cuneiform. Here's what cuneiform looks like. It's not really pictures, it's more like lines and dashes. For Egypt, the other part of the Fertile Crescent. So you notice we're in North Africa here. Mesopotamia is up here someplace. We're right below the Mediterranean Sea. We're just west of the Red Sea. The only river we need to know for Egypt is the Nile River. Remember, it flows from south to north, so it empties into the Mediterranean Sea in Lower Egypt, where the elevation is a little bit lower than it is down here in Upper Egypt, near Nubia. A good thing about this area and a good thing about the Nile River is that we know exactly when it floods. It floods the same time every year, so it's very predictable, unlike the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. There are many natural barriers. The Sahara Desert is basically all of this area in Africa. You could fit the United States in there and it would fit, and it's all desert. So very few people would ever walk all the way across Africa to come and invade Egypt. There are also cataracts or rapids in the Nile River. Down here there's a cataract. I think there's another one around here. So those are basically rapids and waterfalls. So you can't bring boats through those areas. And the Nile Delta at the very top in Lower Egypt, right here as the Nile empties into the Mediterranean, is the Nile Delta. It's good for a few reasons. One, it's very fertile, so you can grow lots of food there. Second, it's marshy and swampy, so no one's going to, it makes it very difficult to come and invade there. Now, we discussed how many people even today live by rivers. Here's a map of modern day Middle East and North Africa. And we can basically tell at night by looking at the light shining where people live. So obviously this really dark area is the Mediterranean Sea. So that's all water. Here's the Nile Delta. You can easily see the triangle. And here's the Nile Valley. Lots and lots of people living along the Nile Valley. Very few people live all the way out here in the Sahara Desert. A couple towns and villages out here, but very few because there's no water. You can actually also see the Tigris and Euphrates over here. There's the Euphrates down here, and then here's the Tigris. So even today, many people still live by river valleys. Cultural stuff for Egypt. Just like the Mesopotamians, they're polytheistic, and their gods and goddesses control pretty much everything. The pharaohs or the rulers are chosen by the gods, so very few people would ever argue with the pharaoh. Whatever the pharaoh said is pretty much how it went. After people died, people believed in an afterlife in ancient Egypt. And this is one of the reasons why the pyramids were built. The pyramids were built as a place of tombs, burial tombs for the pharaohs, and they wanted to make them special and really cool for the pharaohs so that they could basically live in there in the afterlife. And the Egyptians also developed a writing system. Theirs is called hieroglyphics. So there's what hieroglyphics look like. Notice that hieroglyphics are much more like pictures rather than cuneiform in Mesopotamia, which is lines and dashes. Cuneiform is actual picture. So here's a person sitting, some sort of animal, a pig. So these are actual pictures. Okay, that is it for our homework for this evening. Please don't forget to fill out the question sheet if you have not done that already, which you can find just below the video or in Student View.